Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for recently finished Big Brother season, this time talking about Big Brother 27, where obviously like all my other player rankings, I'll be running through the cast, ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this season. Now, also mentioning the fact here that obviously, this video is coming out before the season review for Big Brother 27, which, again, is a bit of a change from how I typically do it, though, again, like I talked about my AU vs. the World player ranking, and I am just behind on videos at this point, and this video is quicker to make than the review, so again, this is coming out first, then, again, expect the review whenever it's done, which I hope is soon, but again, can't promise exactly when. But either way, let's start the ranking. We got 17 players to rank here, so let's start off at number 17, and I actually feel like this is a very difficult player ranking here in the sense that I do feel like how I would rank these people as players and how they played on this season are pretty different, especially for people towards the bottom of the list. And obviously, I feel like Blockbuster plays a major factor into that. But ultimately, at number 17, I did end up going with the first boot of the season. We do have Zay. And again, this is a little bit difficult because I do feel like Zay is actually probably a better player than certain other people on this cast. I feel like Zay demonstrated a level of potential and got a little bit unlucky in the sense that the accomplice twist was something that put a target on his back, and beyond that, he also had someone like Rachel Riley who's willing to push to switch the vote onto him. But ultimately, again, I feel like Zay is someone here that on most given seasons probably is a fine player. Now, ultimately, again, he didn't know the game that well, and I don't feel like this is necessarily a season for him, but I do feel like Zay is a player that on a lot of seasons probably just makes it deep fairly easily and maybe can turn it up at the end, win competitions, make some moves. And ultimately, again, I think Zay is not a terrible player, and I think a better player than certain people are going to be talking about. But again, on this player ranking, it's tough to put him higher in a spot where, again, he was legitimately the first boot. I mean, this was a spot where, while, yeah, I do think he was unlucky to be on the block to begin with, once he was on the block, he was the person that was going home had he remained on the block by the end. It's not like a spot where he got unlucky with how the Blockbuster played out. Now, even then, to credit him there, he at least had 5 votes to save him. He had people that did want him in the game. And I do feel like Zay made less critical errors in the game. Yet also, it's just a spot here where, despite this cast, again, being an all-time bad cast, strategically, I don't think it's a cast where nobody has any merit to them. And because that, again, I kind of land Zay as someone that isn't a bad first boot here, yet ultimately still is a first boot. And that lands him here at number 17. Now, number 16, moving on to the second boot of the season, we have Amy. And again, this is a spot where I think Zay is probably a better player than Amy. I think Amy is someone that, while not, again, absolutely horrible either, is someone that probably doesn't make it as deep on most given seasons. And if she does, she probably makes it deep with no win equity, where, again, it felt like no one on this season really took Amy seriously. Yeah, despite that, Amy's game on this season, again, wasn't great, but also not, like, really awful to the point where, yeah, she was nominated both weeks. She was in the house. Yeah, she almost goes home that first week, where had it not been for Rachel and Morgan pushing for her to stay, she probably does go. And she kind of gets taken out in that second round in a spot where I don't feel like she did enough to try to get the target off her back, where really there was no reason why Jimmy should have actively been targeting her at that point, where there were just so many more ripe options. And the fact that he landed on Amy is something I'll, again, criticize there for Amy. But ultimately, again, Amy is someone here that is probably not the most skilled for the game naturally, yet, again, still survived over Zay. That's at least something. Still had allies on her way out. I mean, even when she was leaving, again, people like Morgan, people like, obviously, Rachel and Ashley wanted her to stay. People like Morgan even wanted her to stay, to where, again, it's not like she had no one in the game. To her, again, I do think it is actually kind of close between her and Zay. It is the fact that, again, she survived over Zay. That ends up being the tiebreaker here, because, again, I think in a ranking of them as players, in the grand scheme of things, I think Zay's probably a better player. But again, in terms of their games on this season, I do think Amy surviving over Zay is obviously an edge there. That lands her a spot higher here, number 16. Now, number 15, moving on to a player that I think is also probably a better player. What his game actually showed us, where I think his game is actually one that's pretty bad in the grand scheme of things. But I do think there's a lot of skills there as a player, and that player is Jimmy. And again, Jimmy's in a spot here where he ultimately gets taken out as one of the few people that was the initial target coming into the Blockbuster, where, again, that is something that definitely disfavors him on this list, where, again, a lot of the people that we'll be talking about after this that, again, maybe aren't even as good of players in my mind as Jimmy, or at least I wouldn't have as much faith in as Jimmy, are players that were not the initial targets. And I think that's something that definitely helps them on this list. All while with Jimmy, again, he was backdoored. by his own allies and proceeded to be taken out in a spot where he had no real chance to save himself if he stayed on the block. And again, that's bad in comparison to a lot of the people that we're about to be talking about who had more of a chance to stay and got fairly unlucky of how the blockbuster played out. Though, with that said, again, Jimmy is someone that definitely had a lot of influence early on in the game. I mean, Jimmy is someone that was pretty solidly positioned from the very beginning. Mind you, playing a bit too blatantly to where I'm sure it would have caught up to him anyway, but still, again, had a lot of alliances there, and ultimately, again, gets his way by the end of the week. But again, we do get to his HOH, which he just plays all wrong from multiple facets. I mean, first in the fact that he doesn't listen to his allies and ends up isolating through that, which is again a major reason why Mickey and Morgan ended flipping on him a few weeks later. But also, and they were kind of right in the fact that, again, him putting up the likes of Will and Amy were not ideal positions for him, where again, the fact that he never ended up nominating Riley, someone that he had no real connection with, was something that was pretty asinine at the time. And again, doing all this while burning your own allies, just an inoptimal play where it really just feels like he was doing these things to try to remain in the favor of the entire house, and again, have like Keanu and Kelly be okay with him, when it's like, who cares about Kelly and Keanu? Where again, I feel like he plays that entire week all wrong. And while I do feel like he kind of recovers to a degree the following week, where again, he's able to not be targeted by Lauren, honestly, by the time he ends up going home and is taken out by Mickey, again, that's a pretty bad move from Mickey, but also, again, definitely showing just how much Jimmy has burned Mickey in the game to make her willing to do something like that. And again, once he was on the block, he was essentially a dead man walking had he not won Blockbuster. So ultimately, again, Jimmy's just a player here that, in comparison, next few people we'll be talking about, is probably a better player. But again, in terms of the game they played on this season, I do feel like Jimmy kind of has a fundamentally worse game, particularly due to how dead to rights he was by the time he hit the block. So ultimately, again, I have Jimmy here at number 15. Now number 14, we're moving on to a player that, again, I think is worse than Jimmy, yet again made it further, and again wasn't the target and got a little unlucky at points, and that player is Adrian. And Adrian, again, is a player here that is very frustrating in the sense that I think there were skills there for Adrian to be a good player, but then he just simply did not want to utilize them. Again, Adrian's a player here that was very adverse to lying in the game and would condemn people for lying, and again, that was very frustrating to watch. Along with the fact that he also had fairly poor reads on the game. Again, he did not seem to be particularly aware what numbers he could have potentially gotten, where realistically, when Adrian ends up going here, it's a spot where he really shouldn't be going. And he was an integral number for the likes of Vince and Zach in particular. And the fact that they don't fight for him to stay is pretty bad. The fact that he also kind of throws away his relationship with Keanu, despite the fact Keanu is still pretty undyingly loyal to him, is also pretty bad. So again, he ends up getting voted out here in a spot where the votes were there for him to stay, and he's just never able to corral them together, which technically happened twice. Again, back in week 2, a similar thing happened had he stayed on the block and was up against Will, where while Amy was always the target above him, again, if it was him versus Will, again, the votes would have been there to save him there as well, yet he just simply did not push enough to get those votes in his direction. And I feel like Adrian just ends up being a fairly ineffective player. But again, in comparison to the last few people we've talked about, who again were the people that would have gone home if they didn't win Blockbuster, Adrian is in a spot here where he is a little screwed by the Blockbuster. Again, it is a position where Kelly would have gone home had not been for the Blockbuster. Also, even in week 2, again, for that to matter, it would have required me to win the Blockbuster, and also Keanu and Kelly to not have their powers. Where, again, I do think there was a lot of unlucky circumstances that caused Adrian to be in these positions. Yet, also, again, Adrian is still a player here that is largely ineffective in the game. I mean, the fact that he was even nominated by Lauren is just kind of insane, which is obviously a thing that we'll talk about when we get to Lauren, but also definitely a negative thing to call out here for Adrian's game as well. Again, I do think Adrian plays this season pretty poorly by the end, though ultimately, again, got a tad unlucky at points, a bit more so than the previous players we've talked about. So again, I am going to land him here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to a player that made it much further into the game. And this is definitely a player that I think is, again, a worse player than a lot of people we've already talked about, yet they made it so much further into the game. And obviously the format of the season definitely played a factor into that. But at number 13, I am going to go with Kelly. And genuinely, I think there's a serious argument that Kelly is the worst player on this season. I think Kelly is a player that does a lot wrong throughout the early portions of the game in particular. And the fact that she was socially just annoying her fellow players, the fact that she volunteered for the block almost every week for those first few weeks, in spots where she would have likely gone home in weeks 2 and 3 had she remained on the block there. And even in week 1, had she been on the block against Amy, she likely goes as well. She also likely goes during the cat boot week had she not won the blockbuster. And it just really feels like Kelly's this type of player that would have been an early boot on most given seasons, yet again was given multiple chances to survive here because of the blockbuster and because of her mystery veto, to where somehow she ends up getting all the way to 7th place. And even then had a path to stay, at least. I think ultimately it probably would have fallen through, and I do think Vince likely would have sided with taking out Kelly over Lauren, but again, there's at least a chance for her to stay there, to where Kelly, again, plays an awful game. Yeah, I actually do think there are things to mention here that are at least minor pros for Kelly, particularly the fact that, again, there were some weeks later into the game where she wasn't targeted and not put in the block. That's at least something. Also beyond that, I think also Kelly actually had a fairly accurate read on the game where, again, even though she was blindsided when Adrian goes home, she at least at that point knows that she can't be trusting Vince anymore, which is, again, more than I could say for that next person that we'll be talking about, where I think Kelly at least had a little bit more game sense in that light, though just had the overall complete wrong philosophy of how to approach the game, and also just was not good enough socially to get around that either. And beyond that, again, she also had a connection with Ava and Lauren by the time she left, where it seemed like they were a trio that could have gone to the final 3, which in that spot, again, there was talks about how she would potentially win a jury vote against Lauren, though ultimately, again, that is a major issue with her game. Also is the fact that I don't know if she can even win if she gets to the end. Now, again, those conversations about her versus Lauren were mentioned where, again, maybe she could beat Lauren, but really outside that, it does seem like she struggles to win any other jury vote. And even then, it even feels like the Lauren situation was more so based around how poorly Lauren played around her perception, that even then I think could have potentially changed had she somehow gotten to the end, where I do feel like Kelly is a player here that does so much wrong, and I think is easily one of the worst players of the season, if not the worst player of the season. Yeah, again, when we're talking about the game she played on this season, again, yes, it is still bad, but I do think there were, again, these minor strengths along the fact that she, again, made it very deep into the season, even though she probably shouldn't have. So I'm going to land her here, number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to a similar style of player, also someone that was a social pariah, also someone that should have probably been booted way earlier than what they ended up being, but again, they made it very deep into the game, and at number 12, I do have Keanu. And again, Keanu is a very difficult player to assess here, because Keanu is someone that probably does almost everything wrong in the game. He's someone that has pretty bad reads, particularly based around his position in the game, always thinking he's much safer than what he really is, and acting around bad information. He ends up not believing when people tell him accurate information, ends up believing inaccurate information instead. He also is in a spot where he needs to win vetoes or blockbusters for a good chunk of the game to remain in the game, and it's a spot where, again, he realistically should have been the second move of the season. Had it not been for the mystery competitor power, he likely goes home there if he doesn't win blockbuster. And again, it's just a spot here where Keanu just seems like a type of player that would be an early boot on most given seasons, like a very Devin Shepard-esque player, yet on a season like this was given the opportunity to make it very deep. Yet because he made it very deep, again, it becomes a very difficult spot to rank him, because he actually did seem to have win equity. Again, getting all the way to the final 5 in a spot where, had he been able to get power, potentially get Morgan out, he probably is the most likely to go on to win the game at that point. Again, obviously probably dominating endgame competitions, along with also seemingly having a level of respect for just how much of an underdog story he had, to where, again, I do think Keanu is someone that definitely had winner potential towards the end, and comes fairly close to winning the game in that light, though also should not have been in that position to begin with. And again, it makes it a bit difficult to assess him because of that, because I think a lot of his play before that is awful. Again, the fact that he had almost nobody in his corner, really the only person that actively wanted to keep him in the game for fairly deep was Rachel, and even then he did not believe a lot of what she said, and again would target her at points, and again that was very misguided, and also again playing a terrible social game. And realistically, if he does go on to win the game at the end, it would largely be based around his story more so than his actual treatment of people, where again people just simply did not like him, and again he would talk down to people and really gloat about how likely he is to win the game, which definitely turns some people off, to where, and I do think there are definitely a lot of missteps here of Keanu. Yet ultimately, again, in comparison to the people that we've talked about so far, again, he obviously makes it deeper than any of those people. Also, compared to Kelly, I think he had a lot more win equity. Mind you, I actually do think Kelly probably had a little bit more game sense in the sense that I think she at least could suss out what was correct information more often. Mind you, I actually do think Keanu, if he had the correct information, would have a better strategic mind for the game, where it does feel like he at least was somewhat aware of what you should be doing in the game of Big Brother, just again not being aware enough of his own position to really utilize that information for his benefit. But I think Keanu is someone that there are some skills there for the game, especially when you mix in his ability to win competitions, though ultimately again on this season he's someone that really should have been booted much earlier than what he ends up being, though it is the fact that he somehow gets towards the end and has seemingly a decent amount of win equity is again enough to put him here at number 12. Now number 11, and now we're moving on to a player that, again, is booted earlier in the last few people we talked about. Also had higher highs to their games, money also maybe even a lower low. But either way, at number 11, we do have Zach. And Zach is also a very difficult player to rank here because there was a point where Zach was the clear frontrunner to win this game. I feel like Zach really spent the first few weeks in probably the best position in the game, having a decent backing of allies, no one targeting him, having a power as well, where it really felt like Zach was really a shoo-in to at least make it deep into the game and at that point be able to win out. And again, it felt like Zach was someone that felt primed to go on to win this game. So the fact that he ends up completely blowing that by the 5th week is pretty astronomically bad. Mind you, I do think he had to be a tad unlucky to get into that predicament, but it's still a spot here where he obviously had this power that should have kept him safe and it should have been a no-brainer to use it, yet he just for some reason doesn't use it. Again, just completely asinine that he literally had a way to save himself and doesn't. Mind you, again, minor credit in the sense that he at least was not actually the primary boot at that point, where again, had Keanu not won Blockbuster, Keanu would have been going in that position. And even then, even in the vote between Vince and Zach, there's at least some push and pull there on where it would go, with Rachel seemingly backing Zach, though ultimately, again, he kind of lost people like Riley and Kat, and also, again, didn't have someone like a Morgan, to where, again, he had an out there, though ultimately, again, him still not using his powers, just astronomically bad. But even then, during that week, he is a bit unlucky that he's even nominated to begin with, where it did seem like Ava was initially wanting to nominate Ashley instead of him. Yeah, she has to be convinced out of that. And really beyond that, again, his game before that was fairly decent. And again, had he survived his boot round, he actually was in another pretty solid position in the game. Essentially would have picked up the positioning that Vince had while also still having a power. And again, Zach is not an entirely bad player here, though. Again, there's just a lot of frustrations here over how exactly he played. Again, him not using his power, the fact that he also was not a particularly active player at points, where again, him not pushing to save Adrian and it folding in that position was definitely poor play. He obviously ends up being blindsided when Zay goes home, and that's not good either. And again, it certainly wasn't the best path through the game they could have had, though ultimately, again, I do feel like he had some very strong positioning throughout those early few weeks of the game, only to be kind of sniped out of that. But also, again, he kind of did it to himself as well, where it's kind of just this mixed bag of a game by the end. But ultimately, again, I do think in comparison to Keanu, who again literally would have gone home during Zach's boot round had he not won Blockbuster, I do feel like Zach is better than that. So again, he's here at number 11. Now number 10. And now we're moving on to a player that I did have a big debate between this and the next person, where I feel like this is a player that definitely had a lot more influence in the game throughout the early portions of the game, yet also just has such an astronomically bad end to their game that did knock them down all the way to number 10 here. And that player is Mickey. And Mickey, again, is a player that seemed to be playing a pretty strong game for those first few weeks. Really, for the first 2.5 weeks, I feel like Mickey was in one of the best positions in the house and had a lot of influence in the game. Definitely had people like Ava and people like Will and Ashley in her corner, to where, again, definitely felt like she was playing a strong game up to that point, though eventually she does start to be targeted alongside Morgan by the opposing side, and again, that kind of lessens her positioning. But even then, she's someone that still had pretty good positioning within her own group, until she decides to essentially just blow up her game during her HOH week, which again, she technically stole from Riley, which I will say, again, impressive play in tricking Riley there, but also not good in the sense that she tricks Riley only to proceed to want to keep him anyway, and ultimately ends up targeting Jimmy, one of her closest allies. Now, again, Keanu won veto and definitely got unlucky in that, but still, again, her deciding to target Jimmy by the end of the week, such an astronomically bad move, taking out a number that was on your side. Also, empowering the opposition, and also leading to Mickey really just gaining this like god complex in the game, like her thinking that she's running the entire show and thinking that she can control every little thing, with her like leading this tirade against Rachel at that point, and talk about how she's like running Ava's HOH the following week, and it really ends up burning her social capital to the point where pretty much everyone drops her in the game at that point, even her own closest allies, and the likes of Ashley and Will talk about being willing to let Mickey go. Ava starts hating Mickey to the point where she's actively wanting to target her, and she ends up spending her last few weeks in the game really on the bottom and really prepared to go home, only to then be saved by the Blockbuster or the Veto, which really saved her, as again, it felt like a spot where it was kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, she would be voted out in those positions, and really it's not a shocker that she proceeds to be then taken out the next time that she doesn't win one of those competitions, to where she's essentially just kind of winning out in those last couple rounds before she ends up going, with her being such a pariah in the game at that point, to where, again, I think that's definitely something to knock Mickey down here, where, again, in comparison to the next person that we'll be talking about, that's a person that technically was meant to survive over Mickey, in a spot where Mickey, again, had been surviving for a few rounds through competition wins, to where, while I do think Mickey had more influence in the game than the next player we'll be talking about, I just feel like the positioning of the next player we'll be talking about, and also their path beyond their boot round, was probably a tad better than Mickey's, to where, again, I do think Mickey ended up being kind of an awful player by the end, but again, one that had, again, some highs and lows, but ultimately landing her here number 10. Now, number 9. Now we're moving on to, again, a player that was not particularly active in the game, and someone that definitely had less influence in the game than Mickey, but also someone that was not meant to go home her boot round. And at number 9, I do have Catherine. And Catherine is, again, a player here that was not the primary target during her boot round. It was meant to be Kelly, and even then she was only put up due to the veto being used. Even then, it was, again, a big debate on who would go up, and again, to be fair, definitely criticized Catherine for not pushing a bit more and getting herself off the block, but I do think there were some unlucky circumstances there, especially again in her elimination, where again she wasn't the initial target. Mind you, again, her game before that was not great. I mean, she does spend the early portions of the game without any true alliances, just has like a relationship with Riley and Lauren, and even her relationship with Lauren was one that was not super integral in the game for either of them, where neither of them seemed to be thinking about taking the other too deep into the game. And really outside of Riley, it felt like Catherine had no real path forward in the game, where I mean, to be fair, this is kind of indicative of their relationship as well, but it really felt like Riley took the reins of their game and be the person that talked to other people about their game, to where Catherine just simply did not have many game chats early on in the game, and was not particularly well liked by a good chunk of the cast as well, to where, and she obviously had this feud with Ashley. There was also this kind of feud between her and Morgan and Mickey, and again, it really just felt like a spot where Catherine was just kind of hanging on the bottom of the game for a lot of the game. Sure, again, this is a big debate here between her and Mickey for me, where I do think Mickey is someone that had higher highs, but also had much lower lows, where Catherine, I do think, does a lot less actively wrong. Again, more of her issues come from her being passive, while, again, Mickey, I think, does a lot actively wrong towards the back portion of the game. But I do think Kat had, again, a modicum of potential had she stayed, and she at least had allies by the time she left. She at least had an idea what she should be doing in the game. Mind you, again, don't really have the confidence in Kat as a player to be able to execute on that, but I do think in comparison to Mickey, who had kind of burnt all of her connections by the time she left, I feel like there was at least more of a path there for Catherine. So again, ultimately going to land her here at number 9. Now, number 8, I can't believe this player's at number 8 because this player sucks as a player. Again, this is about the game they played on this season, and they kind of got snuffed out of the game, and that player is Riley. And again, Riley's someone that I don't have much positive to say about him as a personality on the show, and also I don't even think he's a good player in the sense that he made some terrible decisions in the game, like never trusting Keanu, but Keanu being undyingly loyal to him convincing Lauren to use the veto, despite the fact that that actually led to him getting nominated himself. Saw him be pretty hot-headed at points, and in general, again, I feel like Riley is a player here that has a lot of naturally bad skills for the game, yet ultimately his game on this season doesn't play out in a terrible way, where realistically it's a spot here where a lot of the house just genuinely liked him, and I don't know what exactly they were seeing in comparison to what we were seeing, but again, it felt like Riley was someone that a lot of people really just gelled with in the house, and very few people directly wanted to target. Even in his boot round, it's a spot where had Mickey not won the blockbuster that week, Mickey would have gone home. And even then against Riley and Morgan, a lot of people didn't even want Riley necessarily to go. They more so just wanted Morgan to stay. And also like comes down to one vote, and it came down to the last second. And again, I feel like Riley is someone that kind of gets sniped out of the game in a spot where he was really poised to really just run the entire show. Now again, I don't have confidence in Riley to do that, but he definitely had the social capital in the game to do that. Again, he had these connections with the likes of obviously Catherine and Kelly and Keanu and even Lauren, even Ava is someone that really liked him. And it really just felt like had he not been taken out in the spot he was poised to really just run the entire season. And I think in general, had Rachel Riley not been on this season, I think it would have been one very prime for Riley to just kind of steamroll things. Yeah. Again, it doesn't happen. And again, I think you definitely can blame Riley for a lot of those things. But also, I do think he just gets unlucky at points too, to where, again, it's a bit of a tough game to wrap my head around here because, again, it's another player here that is not a good player, yet the game they play on this season is fairly strong considering their placement. And to be honest, I think there's also maybe an argument he could even be potentially higher. Yeah, I just really don't want to do that. So again, I'm going to land him here, number 8. Now, number 7, moving on to a player that I also debated a bit on. I think it's a player that was to a degree screwed in the game. Definitely got a lot of unlucky breaks to cause their eventual elimination. Yet also, I don't know how well poised they were to really win by the end anyway. And that player is Will. And again, Will is just very difficult to rank here because Will was someone that was very well liked by his cast. Definitely someone that was fairly respected on a personal level. Now, again, I don't know how much game respect that necessarily translates to. I don't know if Will was someone that was very likely to win a jury vote or not. Yet again, was someone that definitely people liked. And I think in a cast here, especially of, again, some very questionable players, having, again, this inherent likability is something that is definitely going to help you in a jury vote in that position when there are, again, so many other like potential goats on the board. Yeah, beyond that, Will's someone that actually, again, was one of the safest players in the game. He really spent a lot of the season, especially after those first few weeks where he was being nominated, again, fairly safe. No one actively wanted him out of the game. And also, again, talks stopped of even like potentially putting him up, particularly due to, again, his negative reaction to Lauren putting him up in week 3. But again, it feels like that actually turned people away from putting him up, which again was effective here, even though I don't know how intentional it was. Again, I don't think it was intentional. But he spends, again, most of the game in one of the best positions in the game. And that's definitely something to give Will a lot of credit for. I mean, there's not really much of a reason to get rid of him, though. Again, it's not like a spot where the correct move would have been to target him. It really wasn't, as again, he's someone that ended up being injured for a lot of the season and obviously just on the other side of things to begin with. So again, not going to do particularly well in competitions. To where even the fact that he was booted in the spot he is kind of insane. Again, the fact that he was taken out over Ashley is pretty ridiculous. And again, credit to Ashley for staying that week, but also, again, definitely something negative here against Will, where I really feel like, again, ultimately Will's just a player that doesn't really push enough. He really just was, again, kind of a yes man that didn't really push his agenda. Now, again, I'll give him credit for the creation of the judges, where that's something that he did push a bit, but ultimately, again, he's just someone that was a fairly passive player in the game, yet again, was also a very safe player and one that really gets taken out due to some very unlucky circumstance. The fact that Keanu had won the blockbuster in a spot where he would have been safe. Also a spot that Morgan won the veto in a spot where she would have been taken out instead of him. Also a spot where Rachel had just gone and completely blew up his entire power structure. I do think Will got fairly unlucky to be in that position to begin with, where again, a lot of things had to go wrong for him to end up going home there. Yeah, again, it's still a spot where I do think there was poor play there and him not being able to push, they should say, over Ashley. And again, I don't know how much drive there really was from him either, as again, it felt like he was kind of just resigned to going home towards the end, with him, again, not feeling he had much of a chance to win anyway. And again, ultimately, again, I do think Will is a player here that definitely had a lot of skills for the game. And I think if Will were younger, he probably actually would have been a really strong player here. Yet ultimately, I don't know what his path necessarily was, especially once his side ends up fracturing around him to where he would have needed the likes of Ashley or Ava to win competitions for him, which they obviously don't end up doing much of, to where, again, Will is someone that I don't think had a path to the end at the time that he was taken out. Yeah, definitely had some strong positioning for a lot of the games. So again, I do have him here at number 7. Now, number 6. And now we're moving on to a player that I debated putting below Will because I feel like Will got a lot more unlucky in the game, and I feel like this player is actually probably a worse player in the grand scheme of things, but also, again, made it further, and also somehow avoided being targeted for most of the season, and that player is Lauren. And again, I think there's a debate here between her and Will. I feel like Will is someone that probably played more optimally for more of the season. I think also a player that probably had a lot more inherent jury respect, where again, Lauren's someone that actually by the time she goes, there's a lot of talk about no one really wanting to war for the win, where while we did have like people like Keanu and Morgan hyping up how much of a threat she was, really a lot of the talk from the others was just how much no one really respected her because she wouldn't make a decision for herself, how even Kelly would beat her at the end, which is again definitely not good. Like, I do think Lauren's win equity is something that definitely seemed to be kind of lacking at the time that she left the game. But also, I feel like she's a player that could have potentially got some of that back. I do think she's someone that obviously was very primed to win a lot of the endgame competitions, and I think that's something that obviously could have gained her favor with the jury. Also the fact that I feel like she started to at least know what she should be doing to a degree by the end. Again, targeting Morgan, talking about how Morgan's the biggest threat. Yeah, though ultimately, again, is ineffective in getting her out by the end, though to fair, again, she kind of had her on death's row at a point, though again, Morgan ended up saving herself, but it's still a spot where definitely will criticize her win equity and really just how she approaches the game, where, again, no offense to Lauren as a person, but it very much feels like Lauren's someone that was not really meant to play Big Brother. While she was, again, young and good at competitions, it really doesn't feel like she had much of that killer instinct to really play the game, and it didn't really feel like she had that drive or that life experience to really play the game. And again, a lot of that lack of win equity really comes from her own decisions, or really lack thereof. The fact that she was so indecisive at points and would make it very known to other players how indecisive she was and how she just wouldn't say anything to people and wouldn't give them an answer about things. And again, it just really led to people just having no respect for her game. And mixing that and the fact that she also makes some questionable decisions, particularly in her first HOH, her putting up Adrian by the end was a really bad call, and not pushing to evict Will by the end also was bad. Also, I do think you can qualm with her usage of the veto on Vince, though again, I think that's one that has some positives and negatives to it, but she actually did also avoid being on the block for a good chunk of the season. Now, mind you, again, there were talks about potentially putting her up, but no one actually did until Vince put her up in her penultimate week. Now, again, obviously criticize the fact that Vince does put her up, because that's a pretty insane call at that point, but the fact that she wasn't able to get Vince to not do that, again, definitely is a negative here. And also her being on, again, a bit of a high horse time on not wanting to lie and proceeding to not promise anyone anything during her campaigns to stay is also pretty bad. And again, I think Lauren is a player that, again, is pretty bad. I mean, realistically, I think her versus Will, I think Will is, again, a better player, but I feel like Lauren's still someone that, again, obviously survives over Will. Had a good chunk of allies even by the time she leaves, to where had she not been on the block against Ava, she even then potentially stays. Or again, had Keanu stayed on the block, it is likely that Lauren stays during that double. And she had been able to get into this like trio with Kelly and Ava that at a point looked like they could have potentially had a deep run towards the end there. But ultimately, again, I think Lauren's just a player here that has so many downsides here, though also, again, was safe for a lot of the game, seemed to have potential towards the back portion of the game. I think it's someone that had more of a path to the end than someone like Will in particular. So again, I did land her here at number 6.
And now number 5. And at number 5, we're moving on to a player that also spent a lot of the game in a very strong position, would have been tough to get out of the game for a good chunk of the season, yet also probably played a bit too passively by the end. And at number 5, I do have Ava. And again, Ava is someone that I had in pretty high regard for a good chunk of the early season. I did have her at number 1 on my personal power rankings for a good chunk of those early weeks, where again, she was perfectly safe in the game. No one wanted to target her. She was also a pretty integral swing vote at many situations, though always the issue with Ava, even at that point in the game, was how long could she keep this? And that, again, she's not a particularly active player. She's someone that does kind of just make a decision and stick with it, just kind of go along with the people around her, and not seeming to put much strategic thought into her game, and more so just play it based on who she likes and who she doesn't like. And again, that can lead to a lot of frustrations with Ava's game, though I do think Ava for a while was, again, playing the middle fairly well, where again, she was a major swing vote back when Zay went home. She was a major swing vote back when Adrian went home. And I'll give her a lot of credit for that elimination, where that was a spot where Vince and Zach were actually initially planning on flipping during that vote and trying to get Ava on board, and Ava ended up essentially flipping them back, to where, again, I think that's a spot where she deserves a lot of credit there. And then she's a major swing when Riley goes home, to where, again, there's many points in this game where she has this big swing in the game. Yeah, it was always a game that felt like it was eventually going to catch up to her. It felt like she was an active enough player, and when that obviously could win endgame competitions, to where she'd be able to keep that pace. Though, again, I do think she has a pretty strong game up to the White Lotus. Twist happens where Rachel goes home, which again, I do think she plays it all wrong. Mind you, again, it probably doesn't work out in her favor anyway. Rachel probably still loses the challenge even if she was picked first, though. Again, I don't think Ava played that particularly well. Again, at that point, her position of playing the middle kind of evaporates with, again, Morgan and Vince being able to just win a lot of the competitions in the end game and pretty much just dictate the rest of the game from that point, where Ava was obviously outside of their core circle, to where while she obviously gets the Final Four, and to fair, gets the Final Four in a spot where she theoretically has win equity. I mean, people like Will left the game very high on Ava, to where, again, I think there's a shot that Ava could have at least gotten jury votes, especially considering her relationship with Kelly and Lauren, to where, again, I think Ava definitely had potential to win this game, yet it's just a spot where I don't think she was ever getting there. I think it would have been a very difficult path for her. Though, to be fair, even in the back portion of the game, she at least has, again, that relationship with Kelly and Lauren. But had they been able to win out in comps, I think she would have been in a fairly good spot to win the game, probably being both of them at that point. I think the fundamental issue with her game is always the fact that she was a bit too passive and didn't get out the bigger physical threats earlier on in the game. But ultimately, again, still a fine game here. I mean, again, one that I wish she was more active, and again, that would probably actually put her higher than the next person we'll be talking about, who, again, was a more active player in the game. But again, she is someone that still had win equity and was solidly positioned for a decent amount of it. So again, I have her here at number 5.
And now number 4, we're moving on to probably one of the bigger players of the season. The question is, did this player play well? And that player is Vince. And Vince is just a player that I have a very difficult time wrapping my head around. He is a player that had so much influence on this season, or at least the potential to have so much influence on this season, had so much social capital, built so many great relationships from the very beginning, and then proceeded to not utilize any of that to his actual benefit, outside of just the notion of keeping himself safe, which even that he put into a lot of danger. Where, again, Vince is a player here that, again, made a lot of deals, made a lot of promises to a lot of players, had a lot of final twos, made him one of the best position players in the early game, but would just make the incorrect decision at almost every single turn. He is a player that nominated his seemingly closest ally in week 1 because she wanted to go on the block, and even by the time that he put her on the block, she didn't want to go on the block anymore, but he still put her up because he had no other options and knew that he was risking his game at that point. But then again, the following week when he was in power, again, he seemed to be playing fine at that point. Again, well positioned, no one targeting him, well liked, until we get to week 3 where Lauren wins HOH, and then he proceeds to get really the worst of both worlds. Talk to Lauren constantly to the point where everyone just believes the fact that he's running her HOH, but not even actually running her HOH, and actually not even getting his way during that week, which I should also mention, he doesn't even get his way during his HOH week, where while Kelly does end up staying, he does lose Zay, who is a pretty big number for him, while Amy, someone that he was actively competing against, ends up going home. But again, back to week 3, he is targeting the likes of Rachel and Ashley, and proceeds to get neither of them on the block. Again, fails at keeping Lauren in line, and Lauren ends up putting up Adrian, again, a pretty good number for Vince, and proceeds to lead to him voting out Adrian by the end of the week in a spot where he had the votes technically to keep Adrian around, yet he decides not to because he doesn't want to draw a line in the sand, which seemed to be pretty poor play there as well, which again, I do think is the incorrect call there as well. We then get to the Jimmy boot week, where again, that's a week where he gets a lot of the credit on the show for making that move, when in reality he had nothing to do with that and actually didn't want Jimmy to go at all, and only campaigned against Jimmy when it was, again, more so about self-preservation, as again, he was the other option. But again, by that point in the game, Rachel really clocked onto his game and really got a lot of her side to want to target Vinny. His game started to deteriorate, where we get to the Ava HOH, where obviously he's nominated on the block. Now, I will say, I will give him credit for getting the votes to stay over Zach. I think that is something that is fairly impressive, considering Zach was very well positioned early on. And again, I do think his damage control after the Adrian vote was just better than Zach's, which allowed him to get the votes there. Also having that, again, relationship with Morgan pushing that way as well, to where I do think he does a lot of good work during that week, though he also ends up spending a lot of the week just kind of moping around about how other people don't deserve to win the game. And then we get to the Riley eviction round, where ultimately, again, he does vote out Riley, which I do think is the correct call for him. Again, Riley's someone that ultimately would not have taken him super deep into the game, while also, again, he keeps around Morgan, who is someone that obviously does take him very deep into the game. The issue comes from the fact of how does he do this? And really, that's the fundamental issue of a lot of Vince's game, is that even in the points where he is making the correct calls for his game, the way he enacts those is just terrible. It's in a way that just burns jury votes. It's in a way that he just overpromises people and doesn't decide to warn them before he does things, to where it just ends up pissing off more and more people. To where, despite him seemingly trying to appease everybody, he actively plays the game in a way that actually pisses off most of the people that he's playing with. Now, at least minor credit to him that during that week he does end up being added into the judges.
in a spot to where while it initially felt like a fake alliance, it at least does give him, again, at least reason to not be put up over certain other people in the house from, again, the Rachel side of things. And then we get to his HOH week where he once again just plays very sloppy there, constantly talking about wanting to take a shot at Rachel, ultimately to not do that and just put up Kat, which just pisses off the people that he wanted to be working with. Instead, we then get to Keanu HOH, where by that point, Keanu finally realized that he's burned him enough times to where he puts Vince on the block. But even after that, again, Vince just kind of spends a lot of that week just kind of moping around. Would have likely gone had Mickey won the blockbuster, though, again, we'll never really know because Mickey is Mickey. But again, he was in a lot of danger that week, despite the fact that, again, a theoretical ally was in power. And then I think he gets extremely fortunate that Rachel ends up being sniped out of the game following that in a spot where Rachel was definitely not planning on taking him super deep into the game. And while, again, he thought he had the judges to protect himself, I don't know if Rachel would have been protecting him for much longer in the game. And it does feel like a spot there where he really was able to get out his biggest adversary without doing anything. And following that, we do get the Lauren HOH, where Will ends up going home, where he ends up voting to evict Will over Ashley, but not because he actually wanted to do that, and more so because Morgan did, where, again, at this point, Vince's game really just becomes Morgan's game, where in the back portion of this game, again, despite the fact that he still had a lot of influence in the game theoretically, again, he still had, like, specific numbers like Lauren and had, again, a relationship with Keanu, and he really ends up just sacrificing all that to just do whatever Morgan wants. And again, this is a spot where, again, he didn't even want Will to go. He wanted Will to stay and was, like, constantly bringing up counterpoints to why Ashley should go, yet would just never actually push in that direction. And ultimately, we do end up seeing him vote to keep Will as the swing vote in a spot where, again, he's voting in a way that he doesn't want to vote. And then we get to his next HOH, probably the most disastrous of them all, the fact that he fully does whatever Morgan wants during that week, where he's not able to convince Morgan to not use the veto and ends up being goaded into putting up Lauren, someone that he himself has said that was his number one ally that he was going to take to the end. Again, he puts her up because Morgan wants him to. Where, again, it seemed like he was kind of misted into this notion that if he put up a member of the judges, then the judges won't vote for him in the jury, which is just kind of a ridiculous concept. Where, also, again, he puts Lauren in a lot of danger. Well, again, she obviously wins the blockbuster that week and ends up going X in a spot where, again, there wasn't that much he can do when Lauren eventually goes. It still was something that, again, definitely showed the jury that he was just playing Morgan's game, where from that point on, we really just have a lot of the jury members leaving, saying that Morgan is manipulating him. And we do eventually see him take the shot at Keanu at 5, which, too, I think is probably the right call. I mean, more of the issue with his game at that point is that he seemed kind of resigned with going to the end with Morgan, where he did talk about how, again, I guess I'm going to the end with Morgan, where he really shouldn't be. Again, that is definitely something to knock against his game. The fact that it did seem like his intentions were to go to the end of Morgan in a spot where I feel like he very likely loses to her, and even he thought he would lose to her. Though, again, I did think taking out Keanu was a solid move there, obviously taking out the other comp beast in the game, someone that could also beat you in a jury vote. Though I do question his decision to take out Ava over Ashley. Now, realistically, I think both would have probably taken him to the final two. Sure, I don't know if it really matters that much from that point of view, but I think where it matters a bit more is that Morgan would be more tempted to take Ashley to the final two than Ava, to where ultimately, again, I think for him, it's like taking out Ava was probably the wrong call, but it's not that big of a difference. Where really it's, again, more so just his poor play the following week, where really it's like there's no reason he should have lost Morgan's support. The fact that Morgan ends up turning against him at 3 and is ready to cut him from the game. Again, I think that's more so a detriment to how he played that final 3 round, and again, a pro to Ashley and how she played that final 3 round, than really a fundamental mistake at the final 4 round. Again, I just think Vince plays a very sloppy game. Now, the interesting thing about it is the fact that I'm still not super clear on where his jury prospects lie. It does seem like, obviously, by the time he gets to the end of Ashley, he has no real chance there, though. By the way that certain members of the jury were talking, people like Keanu, it does seem like Vince had a shot at least, especially if he was the one to cut Morgan. It did seem like there would have been a good shot that he would have squeaked out enough votes there, but the thing is, we still don't really know if that was something he was going to do. Yeah, again, it does feel like he at least had a modicum of respect from the jury, to maybe in the right scenarios he could potentially win, but it's still a spot where I just think his actual game across season is so optimal. It really just feels like he's playing so much of the game either scared or in a way that is benefiting other players more so than himself, where he just feels so spineless in this game that while I think some of that can, again, benefit him in terms of self-preservation, it also ends up being a complete detriment to his actual positioning in the long term, both in terms of keeping around players that he probably shouldn't keep around, while also lessening his jury prospects along the way, to where Vince, again, to me, is just such a sloppy player. He's here at number 4.
Now number 3, and at number 3, we're moving on to a player that is very difficult to gauge on this season because they were so screwed on this season. Yeah, a player that had a lot of highs across their run, though also, and definitely some lows. But either way, at number 3, I do have Rachel Riley. And Rachel's appearance on this season here was one that gives me so many mixed emotions. Obviously, frustration in the way that she leaves and the fact that she was sniped out of the game through a twist. That was even a spot where the people that were making decisions during that round were even actively trying to get her out of the game. And like Morgan in particular was actually trying to save her. She gets taken out because of, again, a competition, which is just very lame, especially when she had been playing her best game yet, where Rachel Riley is a player that I have very openly talked about. I do not have much faith in Rachel Riley based on her previous appearances. I think BB12 is a terrible game from her. I think BB13 is one that obviously needed a lot of questionable things to lead to her win. And I feel like seeing her play games outside of Big Brother, I did not have the greatest faith in her social strategy ability coming into this season. Yet I feel like Rachel, for the most part, proved me wrong. I feel like Rachel played a very strong game on this season considering the position she was in. Now, mind you, I do think there definitely were some points where I think she was a bit too loose with information. I think there's definitely points where I don't know if I necessarily made the same decision that she made, but I do think for the most part, Rachel played a fairly optimal game, definitely the most optimal game of the season. Again, in a cast that had so many astronomically bad moves week after week after week, Rachel's someone that for the most part you can have faith in trying to play to her best interest and what is actually her best interest. And again, she was ineffective at points, and that's definitely something to criticize her for here. The fact that, again, she tried to get people to go her way that was actually better for her alliance as a whole, yet they just simply not go with it. And things like not putting up Amy, things like not taking out Jimmy. Again, she was very ineffective in those positions. Even her HOH round, where again, I think she makes a very strong move by the end in taking out Riley. Even that was a position where that was not really meant to happen. And it was meant to be Mickey for most of that week. But then again, Mickey went blockbuster and she was able to flip it on to Riley at the last second. But again, it's still a spot where Rachel very much proved me wrong on this season. I think she played easily her best game of her Big Brother career. Still a game of her playing more so from a bottom position, but still able to get power from that. And a game that didn't even require that many competition wins. She only won, obviously, one HOH the entire season. It's a spot where, obviously, this is a very different game from the previous Rachel Riley, who is, again, one of the biggest comp beasts in the history of the show. This time around, she couldn't win competitions, yet it still was able to have a lot of influence in the game. Somehow never be nominated her entire time in the game, which is pretty insane considering how big of a name she was. Mind you, again, there definitely were situations where she would have landed on the block and got fortunate that things didn't really turn out that way, but still, it's a position where I do think that is definitely an impressive stat there for Rachel, especially on a 3 nominee season, that she somehow never touched the block before the jury phase. And what's even more sad is it felt like her game was really climbing towards the end of her game, where I mean, she was in a pretty dire situation for a lot of the early game, where again, her allies were being picked off. She also was not being talked about favorably in terms of jury votes, where people did not want to give her another win. Yeah, I think after the Riley eviction, she's able to really restructure the house in a way that is very beneficial to her, having the judges, also having, again, deep connections with like Will and Ashley, also having Morgan by your side at that point, and Ava is kind of a number. Oh, well, we have like other people being scared to take a shot at her. Mind you, I do think the shot would have been taken fairly soon, and I do think she was not in the greatest short-term position at the time that she ended up going out, where again, at the final 9 round there was definitely a chance that she just gets evicted anyway, where like had Lauren win HOH anyway, Lauren was likely going to target Rachel, and if Rachel didn't win a competition that week, she likely goes home anyway. To where I think that's what makes her boot here so much more frustrating, in the fact that it happens not in a spot where she gets screwed out of the game, in a spot where she really didn't even need to be screwed out of the game. And obviously, again, if she did get taken out in a more natural way, yeah, she's probably a little bit lower on this list. Yeah, again, ultimately, Rachel's someone that, again, did not get formally evicted from this season, played a very strong game outside that, definitely demonstrated a lot of skills that I did not realize Rachel really had on this season. And I do think she played a fairly optimal game, which again is something I feel like I was not expecting from Rachel Riley. And to her, if anything, again, this season really just improves my overall opinion of Rachel Riley as a player, someone that, again, I thought of as one of the worst players to win the game of Big Brother. Yet now I think she's, again, solidly closer to the top of the pack, where again, back when I did my ranking of every Big Brother player, I had her, I believe, in the 70s at this point. post this season, again, I would probably have her like near the 20s. I do think my opinion definitely did go up on her as a player. And again, a lot of that had to do with the fact that, again, she played a very strong game on this season despite being put in a fairly poor position with a lot of people that just naturally did not want to work with her and did not take her seriously. But again, I think she made the most of it and was obviously screwed by the end. So again, I do have her here number 3.
Now number 2, and for me, top 2, pretty definitive. Also pretty definitive ranking here. I don't think there was much of a debate for me. At number 2, I do have Morgan. And straight up, even if Morgan had won this season, I still think I would have had Morgan at number 2. And Morgan is a player here that, again, I think a lot of people will give her a lot of credit for how much she ran a lot of the end game of this season. And again, I do think she deserves a lot of credit for how she was able to manipulate Vince in particular to do what she wanted. Where, again, something I'll never take away from Morgan is how active of a player she was. She was constantly gaming, constantly trying to get her way, and mixed success at points, but again, did get her way a lot of the time. And that is something to definitely give her credit for. However, I think something that for me is very detrimental to Morgan's assessment here is her positioning, where Morgan is a player here that had a very tough road to the end outside of comping out, where really nobody actively wanted to take her to the end. It was really a spot where Vince likely would have taken her to the end, but again, it's Vince. And also even then, again, it was a spot where Vince even knew himself that he needed to cut Morgan, to where who knows if he actually would have taken a shot eventually or not. And really outside that, no one else was taking Morgan to the end. Again, she really was in this spot where either her or Vince had to win competition towards the end game stretch, and she just so happened to do so. Where genuinely, if she had won the game, I don't think there's that much of a difference between her and Jackson Mickey, a player that, again, also had a lot of strategic agency in the game, won a lot of competitions, though was also being targeted for a lot of the game, and really gets saved by the fact that either they or their partner in crime end up winning a lot of competitions. And I feel like Morgan is in a similar position in the game for that end game stretch. Though again, I still think there is a lot to like from Morgan's game here. Again, she is someone that did a lot of the pushing in week 1 to try to get Zay out of the game and was able to eventually get her way there. Same thing with the Adrian boot week, where she was the one to really push Mickey to do it, even though I don't know if that was necessarily good for her game. I think that may be, again, kind of questionable, but again, she at least got her way during that position. Also, even in the Vince and Zach nomination, she was a major swing vote in that position and ultimately pushed to get Zach out. Now, despite that, again, there are points where she did push for things that didn't go through. Again, she did push to try to save Amy and wasn't able to get that. And I do think during the early portions of the game, again, it was a very sloppy game, but there were points where, again, she did get her agenda across, which is something to give her a lot of credit for. Now, obviously, she ends up being nominated by Rachel during her boot week, and again, I think that's just a very wonky week where there's a lot of pros, there's a lot of cons. Again, the fact that she survives over Riley is something that is kind of insane, and I think even though it was a spot where, again, half the house did want her out, it's also a spot where, again, she was able to keep Vince's loyalty. She was able to win back Rachel in a spot where, again, I think she did some pretty poor work to burn her relationship with Rachel before this week, but I do think she does good work in building that back. And obviously we see the formation of the judges, and I do think her being this major glue in that alliance to keep Vince in line and keep that group together really ends up being an impressive aspect of her game following this. And really from that point on, she really is this pretty dominant force in the game, really ruling over Vince's competition wins at that point, and making sure he doesn't target Rachel during Vince's second HOH week, where, again, that was a spot where he seemingly was very close to doing so, yet Morgan was able to convince him to put up Kat instead, and we have her then, again, proceeding to be targeted, but at that point starting to turn it up, winning competitions, which, again, I don't necessarily factor too much here, especially when, again, she kind of needed some of those competition wins, particularly the veto at Final 8. And we do also see her kind of failing to get her way during the White Locust twist, where she wanted Vince to pick her over Lauren, which he doesn't, though ultimately, and then once we get to that endgame stretch, she is really controlling a lot of the game. Mind you, again, a lot of that control being through Vince or through her own competition wins. But again, she is able to convince Vince to put up Lauren, which is a very impressive play there. She's able to convince Vince to go to the final 3 with the judges, which is something he definitely should not be doing. So again, that's impressive. She's able to eventually get Lauren out and seemingly have Vince convinced to take her to the final 2, which is impressive. But again, the issue here is that, again, no one else would have. Again, Keanu was actively targeting her by the end game. Ava and Ashley both talked about she was the biggest threat and they needed to vote her out. Obviously, she eventually does get voted out at the final 3, which that final 3 in particular is just one that is kind of insane, where Morgan ends up switching her mind from taking Vince to the end into taking Ashley, which seems to be the incorrect call. It feels like she probably would have had a better chance against Vince. Mind you, it does seem like she had a pretty good chance of beating Ashley as well, though it definitely would have been more of a shutout against Vince. And I do think she had an overall like misread of the jury at that point. And a lot of that has to do with, again, Ashley's active play, where, again, I think she was just kind of snowed by Ashley in the endgame stretch. It really just felt like she kind of bought into whatever Ashley sold to her, kept on talking about Ashley being this like unbiased party when it's like she's very clearly biased, very clearly trying to benefit her game. Overall, again, Morgan's game for me is just, again, a weird one here. It's one where I do think she very likely wins if she gets to the end. It does seem like she had a lot of respect. I also feel like she, again, had a lot of agency, had a lot of points in the game, and played a fairly impressive game in terms of getting what she wants. But it's also a game that, again, her positioning was fairly weak in the back portion of the game, and she really did have to rely on some comp wins towards the back end of the game, while also, again, having a pretty sloppy beginning to where, ultimately, again, for me, it was not particularly close here between her and the number one spot. I did feel like her positioning in particular is something to really knock here to ultimately land her here number 2. And now number 1, the best player of the season, is, again, not really in doubt for me. I do think there are probably people that are going to have issues with this placement, people that don't think this player did much in the game yet. Again, I think you're wrong. At number 1, I do have Ashley. Obviously, the winner of the season, which is obviously something that gives her a big boon there. But really, even if Ashley did not go on to win the season, I think I would have had Ashley at 1. Had Morgan won final HOH, taken Ashley, and Ashley lost to Morgan at the end, I still think I would have Ashley at number 1 in this player ranking, because I do think Ashley plays what ends up being a fairly impressive game by the end. Now, again, not flawless. I think her early game in particular is very sloppy. Obviously, she was in a spot where she needed to win that first competition, where if she did not win that first veto, and ultimately did not win that blockbuster, she likely does go home that week. And again, that is obviously something to knock against her, but really after that, she ends up being fairly safe in the game, despite the fact that she was starting off the game as this massive social pariah. Again, a position that is very difficult to get out of in Big Brother, where we see so many people struggle after being nominated week 1 to really gain any traction in the game following that. Again, Ashley was able to really recover from that, build relations with the right people, again, still have this connection to Rachel, have connections to Morgan, have connections to Mickey. Mind you, I do think early on in the game, she was kind of sabotaging those, where, again, this weird thing about Ashley is that early on in the game, it did seem like she did not particularly trust Rachel in the game, and talked about potentially wanting to take her out early on. She also, again, very much did not trust Mickey or Morgan, despite the fact that they were actually the people that were like kind of keeping her safe during that early portion of the game. Again, she constantly talked about how they weren't to be trusted, to where, again, did feel like she had very wonky reads early on in the game. And also, I do feel like she was kind of being snowed by people like Zach, someone that she seemingly really wanted to work with, yet despite that, Zach, again, just did not like her and wanted her out. I think those are fundamental issues with Ashley's early game, but it's still a spot where, again, it is fairly impressive that she's never put on the block. The fact that she is able to avoid being nominated by Lauren, which, to be fair, again, is due to the good work of both her and also people like Jimmy, people like Mickey. But again, the fact that she had these allies backing her at that point and was able to avoid the block there, again, I think is very impressive. And I think that's something about Ashley, is the fact that Ashley also is a player that constantly gaming, to where, despite the fact that, again, people do talk about Ashley as if she's someone that didn't do anything in the game, she was doing things in the game. She constantly was gaming. She constantly campaigned. She never gave up. And again, like, from the show perspective, it showed this as a negative. It showed her as her being annoying to Vince when she was trying to stay off the block, when it's like, again, like, that's her trying to stay in the game. And again, it ends up being an impressive aspect of Ashley's game, the fact that she never gives up and constantly tries. And while, again, some things don't work, a lot of it does end up working, which ends up being fairly impressive of her game by the end. But really, again, after the Amy eviction, she does spend a lot of the game kind of just riding with her alliance, not being like an integral piece of that alliance, but is always, like, again, there and is safe. And again, is strategizing with them, is clearly having her agenda, though not doing too much to actually like push her way, until we do get to the Riley eviction, where I think that's a spot where I will give her a lot of credit for the formation of the judges, which ends up being the dominant alliance that runs the entire season, where her and Will were really these two orchestrators of that alliance, getting the numbers together, which obviously pays massive dividends for her in the game. It ends up being this alliance that ends up taking her to the final 3 in a spot where she just has to make one move to go on to win the game. And again, I do think her forming that alliance there ends up being such an integral piece to her game. Again, getting someone like Vinny to be willing to take Ashley to the final 3 is just kind of insane, considering Vinny has no reason to be taking her that deep into the game. To the fact that she's, again, continuously able to avoid going on the block under the notion that we can't put up a member of the judges ends up being very impressive there. And again, a lot of that has to do with her managing of her relationship with Morgan, where I think she very effectively ends up utilizing Morgan in the game as, one, this big shield, but also this big proponent for her game, this person that keeps her safe from Vince in particular, which allows her to get all the way to the final 3. And now we do get a wonky situation during the Mickey boot round, where that is a spot where had Mickey won the blockbuster, again, there are worlds where Ashley could have theoretically gone home there, where obviously she does fail to stay off the block during that week. And again, that is a negative there. But obviously following that, she gets screwed over with Rachel going out, where that was such an integral number for her game, a big shield, while also a loyal ally. And again, that is something that obviously didn't favor her, along with the fact that Will ends up going home next. Now, ultimately, I think that is a week where I do think she plays very well. Again, she's able to keep the target off of her onto Will, which is kind of insane that Will gets targeted over her, where I think that plays into her really managing her perception fairly well. Again, she's able to really balance this notion of being perceived in the house as a GOAT while also having respect outside of the game, again, fairly well. Again, having people like Rachel and Will backing her on the jury while also having not much respect for the players while in the game. And even in that, able to build pretty strong relationships with people on their way out. Again, building strong relationships with Ava, who hated her for a lot of the season, yet by the end loved Ashley as she left. Same thing goes with someone like Kelly, someone like Lauren. Both came out of the game respecting Ashley as a player, which I think is something to credit her with as well. And again, the notion that she stays over Will is still insane. And again, a lot of that has to do with her really managing her relationship with Morgan very well, her managing her relationship with Keanu very well. But for someone like Vince in particular, there is no reason to be keeping around Ashley at that point in the game. And he'd even really want to, yet she was able to keep the votes on her side there. And I think she proceeds to play the game fairly optimally, again, taking out Kelly to really scoop up Ava as a number at that point, also still managing her relationship with Keanu, then proceeding to vote out both Lauren and Keanu in spots where I think that was, again, the right move to make. Ultimately, to get to a Final Four where, again, she did want to take the shot at Morgan, was not able to just due to competition wins, where, again, that is another aspect of Ashley's game, is that she was ineffective in winning competitions, where while I do think she threw some of them early on, she definitely was trying in the back portion of the game, yet was just unable to win any of them. And while there's obviously a certain portion of the Big Brother fan base that will knock her for that, I do think in terms of assessing her game in particular, that is a massive boon here. Despite the fact that she didn't win competitions, she was still able to get the people in power to want to take her deep into the game, with the misconception that she couldn't go on to win the game. While obviously having, again, seemingly a lot of awareness of her game, being able to sell her game very well, while also knowing the move that she had to make. Again, knowing that she had to cut Morgan, and ultimately making that move at Final 3, which obviously, again, I think she gets very fortunate to be in that position to even be in Part 3 of the Final HOH. Again, that took, again, Vince having a colossal meltdown at Part 2, and Morgan seemingly just being sleep deprived in Part 3 for Ashley to get an easy win there. But I do think it's a spot there where Ashley knew what she needed to do and did it. And I think Ashley's game here for me is one where, again, I think it's a solid middle tier winning game of Big Brother. It's one where, again, she was safe for so much of the season, did a lot of legwork to keep herself safe for a lot of the season, ultimately made the right call at the end, knew the decision she had to make. Again, wasn't in a dominant position for a lot of the game, wasn't really this like main driver of a lot of the game, but again, knew what she had to do to go on to win the game, to where despite the fact that, again, she still has some social faux pas, she still has some points where I do question why was she doing that, especially early on in the game. She ultimately ends up playing a fairly impressive game by the end, very comparable to Steve Moses, not exactly in terms of the games being 1-for-1, but I think in terms of having like an intentional strategy that they utilize effectively, end up cutting the biggest threat at the end, having a fairly accurate read on the game, especially in the back portions of the game. But again, actually being able to do that without winning any competitions, and actually being able to convince Morgan to actually take it to the end, something that Steve even failed to do. Again, to me, I think there's a big debate there between Steve and Ashley, but I think they're on a similar caliber of winner, where again, I think Ashley ends up playing a pretty solid game on this season by the end, and was kind of by far the number one pick for this ranking here. But with that, again, that is my player ranking for Big Brother 27, which would typically be the end of my BB27 coverage, but obviously, again, we're switching things around this time around because I don't have the review ready, and again, the review will be out when it's ready, hopefully within the next couple weeks. It's going to be a big video. I have a lot of plans with the video to where ultimately, again, it might take a while, but again, it'll be done whenever I can. In the meantime, as I mentioned before, this month is going to be the first month where I am going to start slowing down in terms of video releases, in terms of only guaranteeing one a week instead of two. So you might see a slowdown of uploads. In terms of that, though, again, until I finish the Big Brother review, a lot of the videos that will be uploaded publicly will be, again, kind of this like backlog of videos I've had on the membership tier for a little bit. These more like timeless recasting videos. So again, you can stay tuned for those. Once the review is out, I'll start working on the normal sort of content once again, and hopefully get into a flow to where I can catch back up and be a bit more consistent at that point, where I do have videos planned already to be making. A lot of Survivor 50 related casting sort of videos. Obviously my ranking of every Australian Survivor player. So again, that is coming up in the somewhat near future. Stay tuned for those. And realize that obviously, again, I'll be back for BB28 next year, doing similar sort of coverage for that. Hopefully be a bit more prepared for the end of that season. But again, we'll have to see. But either way, that is my player ranking for Big Brother 27. Thank you for watching.